Welcome to Occult Archives.
Where we uncover the mysteries, myths, and legends behind history's most feared books.
From mystical grimoires to ancient religious texts, these books carry secrets too dangerous to be read.
Are you ready to turn the pages of the unknown?
This is Season 1, Episode 7, The Talmud Unmasked, Secret Teachings and Controversies.
Let's dive in.
So, you've brought us a really fascinating set of sources.
They all focus on this text called the Talmud Unmasked.
And our mission, if you will, in this deep dive is to kind of unpack what exactly these sources are claiming about the Talmud.
Yeah, where it comes from, what it actually says, and maybe most importantly, the controversies surrounding it.
Especially its alleged secret teachings about non-Jews.
With a particular focus on Christians.
Right. So we're going to look at the historical context, the structure of the Talmud as it's described in these sources, and the interpretations they offer about its views on things like Jesus and Christianity as a whole.
It's interesting. One of the first things you notice when you start looking at these sources is this sort of almost like a disclaimer up front.
Yeah, disclaimer, that's a good way to put it.
Almost like they're trying to set a tone.
Right.
They argue that Judaism is, quote, the most tolerant religion globally when it comes to non-Jews.
And that any, ancient rabbinic precepts that might have been unfavorable towards Gentiles don't actually apply to Christians.
Yeah, they even go so far as to say that, respected rabbis taught love and respect for Christians as believers in the true God.
And encourage praying for them.
Yeah.
It's an interesting starting point for where they're about to go.
For sure.
So how about we get into the meat of it?
Let's dive in.
These sources then go on to explain the origins and structure of the Talmud as they see it.
Okay.
According to them, it all started with oral traditions and commentaries from rabbis in Palestine.
Way back even before the time of Jesus.
Imagine that.
These early discussions, interpretations of Jewish law passed down verbally for who knows how long.
Not written in books, but maybe, jotted down in notes or charts or lists.
It's like the foundation of their knowledge, shared and debated within their communities for generations.
Right.
Then, something happens in the 2nd century CE.
Enter Rabbi Jehuda.
Also known as the saint, or sometimes the prince.
He's a key figure in these sources.
He sees that Jewish learning is at risk of being lost.
As Jewish people are becoming more and more scattered.
So he takes on this huge task.
Compiling all those oral traditions and notes into a written form.
That compilation becomes what's known as the Mishnah.
Or Sefer Mishnayth.
Described as a kind of secondary law to the Torah itself.
And it's organized into 6 main sections.
Each with chapters and chapters of legal and ethical teaching.
Okay, so the Mishnah is like the bedrock, the foundation of the whole Talmud.
Exactly, but it wasn't just compiled and put on a shelf somewhere.
It became like the central text for Jewish study and debate.
They emphasized that it was widely accepted by Jews and expounded upon in academies in Babylon.
Places like Surah, Yumbaditha, and Nehardia.
And in Palestine, too.
In centers of learning, like Tiberias, Iamnia, and Lydda.
These weren't just individuals studying on their own.
They were organized groups of scholars dedicated to understanding this text.
And as they studied, they had discussions, interpretations, they made rulings on various points in the Mishnah.
And all of that was written down, too.
But that became the Gemara.
Another vital component of the Talmud.
Building upon and interpreting what was laid out in the Mishnah.
So you've got the Mishnah as like the initial law, and then the Gemara as the record of how that law was understood and applied in different situations.
It makes sense. It's like layers of interpretation and debate building on top of each other.
Exactly. But it doesn't stop there.
Right.
These sources go on to describe the complete Talmud as even more extensive than that.
Okay.
It includes, of course, the Mishnah and the Gemara.
But also other layers of commentary and notes.
Like the Tosefeth, which are like supplements or additions.
And then there are the marginal notes of a rabbi named Asher.
And summaries of those additions called Piskei Tosafot.
And even a famous commentary on the Mishnah itself, written by Maimonides.
It's like a massive library, this Talmud.
63 books in 524 chapters, they say.
And get this, they even mention 4 other shorter tracts that were supposedly added later.
Masacheth Sopharim, Ebla Rebeti, Kala, and Masacheth Derek Eretz.
Which suggests that this wasn't just a static text.
It was constantly being added to and reinterpreted.
To give us a sense of what's actually in this Talmud, they break down its 6 main parts.
The Sederim.
The first one is Zeraim, which literally means seeds.
But it's about more than just planting.
It deals with agriculture broadly, right?
Fruits, herbs, trees, their use.
And it includes books like Barakoth, which focuses on blessings and prayers.
Pira, which is about leaving portions of the harvest for the poor.
Kilim, about forbidden mixtures in agriculture.
And Shebith, dealing with the laws of the sabbatical year for the land.
So Zeraim really grounds Jewish law in everyday life.
Sustenance, social responsibility.
Then you've got Moed, which focuses on festivals.
This is all about the proper observance of the Sabbath and other Jewish holidays.
The timing, the beginning and end, how to celebrate them correctly.
It includes Shabbat, which goes into detail about what's allowed and forbidden on the Sabbath.
Eruvin, which is all about preparing for the Sabbath eve.
Pesachim, the laws and customs of Passover.
Moed highlights the importance of time and remembrance in Jewish tradition.
These festivals aren't just historical events. They're actively commemorated and observed.
And then they briefly touch on nezikin, meaning damages.
This one dives into civil and criminal law.
Baba Kama, which deals with compensation for injuries.
Baba Metzia, which is all about found property and ethical trade practices.
Baba Bathra, which covers real estate and inheritance.
Sanhedrin, which is about the court system and capital crimes.
And interestingly, it also includes Abhoda Zara, which we'll come back to later because it deals with idolatry.
And Apath, a collection of ethical teachings, often known as Perk Apath.
So nezikin basically shows how Jewish law was applied to practical matters of social order and justice.
Right. Okay, so we've got a basic understanding now of how the Talmud is structured according to these sources.
Right. But the real heart of the matter is what these texts claim about the Talmud's view on non-Jews.
And this is where that initial mention of tolerance sort of takes a back seat.
Right. After that brief nod, these sources launch into a very detailed account of alleged negative portrayals.
It's super important to remember here that we're presenting what these sources claim the Talmud says.
Not endorsing these claims as facts or representing universally accepted Jewish thought.
Okay, so one of the first points raised is the name used for Jesus.
The Hebrew name, Jeshua HaNatzri, meaning Jesus the Nazarene.
But they claim that in Jewish writings, this is often shortened to Jeshu.
And they make a pretty bold assertion that this abbreviation is deliberately interpreted as, may his name and memory be blotted out.
That interpretation of the abbreviation is incredibly contentious.
It's not universally agreed upon, and many would absolutely dispute that it carries such a malicious intent.
It's a perfect example of how these sources present a very specific and negative interpretation of Jewish terms and practices.
And then they go on to describe the Talmudic view of Jesus' fate.
They quote the Zohar, which is a mystical Jewish text, as saying that Jesus died like a beast.
And was buried in a dirt heap, along with dogs, asses, Christians, Turks, and even Muhammad.
All lumped together as uncircumcised and unclean.
Likened to dead dogs, the imagery here is incredibly harsh.
It's obviously intended to be offensive.
Again, it's important to understand that interpretations of mystical texts like the Zohar can vary wildly.
And these sources are presenting a particularly negative and extreme reading.
Then they move on to the issue of the worship of Jesus.
They quote Maimonides, who we mentioned earlier, as a really influential Jewish scholar.
They argue that Maimonides attempted to disprove Jesus as the Messiah because he didn't fulfill traditional messianic prophecies.
Like rebuilding the temple or gathering the scattered Jewish people.
Instead, they say that Jesus' arrival led to the destruction of Israel.
And the subsequent worship of what they consider another god.
But then they note a seemingly contradictory idea.
They say that Maimonides also believed that this whole process paradoxically prepares the way for the true Messiah.
And a future universal recognition of God. It's like they're trying to have it both ways.
Maimonides' views on the Messianic era and the role of other religions were definitely complex.
He certainly didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah in the traditional Jewish sense.
But these snippets might not fully capture the nuances of his actual statements.
The idea that historical events, even those seen negatively, could ultimately serve a larger divine purpose is definitely a thread in some Jewish thought, though.
Right.
Turning to the symbol of the cross.
These sources claim that the Talmud uses a number of derogatory terms for it.
Like Sarath Hatalui, meaning image of the hanged.
Elil, which translates to vanity or idol.
Selim, which simply means image.
Skedivirab, warp and woof.
Gokab, star.
And Pesila, carved idol.
They're all meant to be insults, portraying the cross as an idol or something disgusting.
They even cite passages from Jewish legal codes like Orach Chaim and Yor Dea
that seem to prohibit Jews from bowing down or showing respect to those carrying a cross.
to avoid even the appearance of idol worship.
Although they do make a distinction between a cross that's venerated as an idol
And one that might be worn just as an ornament.
The prohibition against idolatry is a fundamental principle in Judaism, deeply rooted in the Torah.
So these interpretations suggest that some Jewish authorities saw the cross as a form of idol worship.
And put rules in place to prevent anything that could be seen as veneration.
Right. The distinction they make about a cross worn as ornament suggests that context and intent were important factors.
They then target core Christian practices.
Specifically, turn the other cheek and love your enemies from the New Testament.
They argue that those teachings are impossible to actually follow.
And they point to instances in the Gospels and Acts where they say Jesus and Paul themselves didn't follow them.
They even quote a writer named Nizikon making this argument.
Those teachings have definitely been subjects of much debate and interpretation across different faiths.
The examples they cite from the New Testament are often points of contention in interreligious dialogue.
Right.
And then comes a very serious accusation.
They claim that the Talmud considers Christians as abhoda zara,
which they translate as idol worshippers.
They quote Maimonides again,
saying explicitly that Christian people who follow Jesus are all engaged in strange worship.
Abhoda zara literally means foreign worship or strange worship.
And in Judaism, it usually refers to idol worship.
If Christians were categorized this way, it would have a huge impact on how Jewish law viewed interactions between Jews and Christians.
They also allege that anyone who possesses copies of the Gospels is considered a men.
A heretic.
And that Rabbi Meir even called these books Aven Gilayan, which means iniquitous volumes.
Minaminim in rabbinic literature can refer to different groups seen as dissenting from mainstream Jewish belief.
So including those who had Gospels in this category shows the historical tension between Judaism and early Christianity.
Right.
There's also this interesting connection they made between Edom,
the Edomites,
and Rome.
And by extension, Christians.
Because of their connection to the crucified Jesus.
They even link the sign of the cross and eating pork to Edomites and Christians.
Edom in Jewish tradition is often portrayed as an enemy of Israel.
So this association with Rome and later Christianity reflects those historical conflicts and theological differences that developed.
And the language they use to describe Christians, allegedly drawn from the Talmud, is shocking.
They call them idolaters, the worst kind.
Worse than Turks, murderers, fornicators.
Impure animals, like dirt, unworthy of being called men.
Beasts in human form. They even compare them to cows, asses, pigs, and dogs.
And say they're worse than dogs.
Their propagation is likened to that of beasts.
Their origin is described as diabolic.
And their souls destined for hell.
They even go so far as to say that a dead Christian body is no different from that of an animal.
It's dehumanizing, to say the least.
The extreme negativity here is deeply concerning.
If these are accurate representations of statements found in the Talmud,
and that's a big if,
it would indicate a period of intense hostility.
It's crucial to approach such claims with extreme caution, considering the historical context.
The potential for bias in interpretation and whether these views were ever widely held or acted upon.
Right.
This alleged contempt then leads to discussions about rules for Jews to avoid contact with Christians.
Because Christians are considered unworthy, unclean, idolaters, and murderers.
You give examples like prohibitions against selling fringed overcoats to Christians.
Not eating their bread or milk unless it was supervised.
Not imitating their customs, not building houses like their churches.
Although they say there were exceptions made if it benefited the Jewish community.
Throughout history, rules about interactions between religious groups have often come up.
Concerns about maintaining distinct identities, avoiding the perceived negative influences of other practices.
These examples suggest a strong desire to minimize contact with Christians.
Based on those negative characterizations we talked about earlier?
And these restrictions supposedly extended to personal interactions too.
Like not being shaved by a Christian unless you had someone watching or a mirror.
Not using a non-Jewish woman as a midwife for a Jewish child.
Because of suspicions of potential harm.
These specific prohibitions point to a deep-seated mistrust.
Anxiety about safety and maintaining religious purity.
They also describe a deep contempt for Christian symbols and practices.
They say that Christian idols, especially the cross, should be destroyed.
Or referred to with insulting names.
Churches are called Beth Tilpha, meaning house of vanity.
Beth Abhuda Zara, house of idolatry.
And Beth Hatarapi Shelet Sim, house of evil laughter.
Jews were supposedly forbidden from entering or even standing in the shadow of a church.
With few exceptions,
Christian music and statues were to be avoided too.
because of the risk of idolatry.
Chalices used in Mass are called vessels of filth.
Christian books, particularly the Gospels, are called minim, or Sifre de Beth Abaddon, which means books of the house of perdition, and were to be destroyed.
Christian prayers are dismissed as tifla, meaning sin or foolishness.
And Christian festivals like Sunday, Christmas, and Easter are labeled Ayon Ed, or Day of Destruction.
Or Ayam Natsri, Christian days, and celebrating them was forbidden.
The use of such derogatory language and all these prohibitions against any engagement with Christian religious life really highlights the extreme negativity these sources attribute to the Talmud.
The intention to create a separation and put down Christian practices is clear.
And perhaps the most shocking claims relate to Christians and Jewish law,
The texts assert that a Christian who studies Jewish law deserves death.
and that baptized Jews should also be killed.
They even go further, saying that killing Christians isn't a sin, but an acceptable sacrifice to God.
That the extermination of Christians is the only necessary sacrifice after the destruction of the temple.
That those who kill Christians will have a high place in heaven.
And that Jews should never stop trying to exterminate non-Jews.
These are incredibly serious and disturbing accusations.
If they accurately reflected Talmudic teachings, they would be unequivocally reprehensible.
Claims that any religious text advocates violence against any group must be treated with the utmost seriousness.
And thoroughly examined.
It's vital to understand the full context, potential misinterpretations, and whether such views, if they ever existed, were widely held or acted upon.
Exactly.
And finally, the source material you provided includes extensive excerpts from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
This is presented as outlining a Jewish plan for world domination.
Through manipulating economies, media, politics, education, you name it.
It portrays non-Jews, called goyim, as easily controlled and inferior.
The Protocols detail strategies for undermining governments, controlling public opinion, establishing monopolies.
All to create a world ruled by a Jewish king.
Again, it's crucial to remember that the source material includes this without endorsing or denying its authenticity.
The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is widely recognized as a complete fabrication.
A blatant anti-Semitic hoax.
It has absolutely no basis in reality.
Including it here, even with a disclaimer, is problematic because it's been used to incite hatred and violence against Jewish people for over a century.
The themes of a global conspiracy, manipulation, non-Jews as inferior are all central to this forgery.
It is not a genuine reflection of Jewish thought or history.
Not at all.
So to wrap up this deep dive into the Talmud Unmasked, you gave us a collection of texts that focus on this topic.
We explored the origins and structure of the Talmud as described in these sources.
From oral traditions to a complex written work.
And then we got into the very serious and often conflicting claims about its alleged views on non-Jews, especially Christians.
Ranging from initial claims of tolerance to some pretty disturbing accusations of contempt, avoidance, and violence.
We also discussed the inclusion of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a known anti-Semitic forgery.
What does all this tell you about interpreting historical and religious texts?
Especially when they're presented through a potentially biased lens.
Yeah, how do we reconcile claims of tolerance with those of extreme animosity?
And what's our responsibility in examining controversial material like this?
Especially when it contains potentially hateful and dangerous rhetoric.
This deep dive, while revealing, definitely opens up more questions.
It underscores the importance of seeking out diverse and reliable perspectives when engaging with sensitive and complex historical and religious topics.